elderly millionaire kept a secret for 5 years, and on her last Christmas, taught her greedy children a lesson they'll never forget. In the snowy streets of Newport, behind the glittering facade of Harrison Mansion, a Christmas story of betrayal, justice, and divine timing is about to unfold. As Margaret Harrison prepares for what could be her last Christmas Eve dinner, 40 years of family secrets are about to surface. Tonight, around the magnificently decorated table where countless holiday memories were made, some will learn that true wealth isn't found in bank accounts, and others will discover that God's justice arrives precisely when it should. Join us for a tale that proves sometimes the greatest Christmas gifts come in unexpected forms, and the truest family isn't always the one you're born into. On Christmas Eve morning, Margaret Harrison knelt in the familiar wooden pew of St. Patrick's Church in Newport. At 75, her once dark hair had turned silver, but her blue eyes remained sharp as she gazed at the nativity scene. The church was quiet, save for the soft flicker of candles and the gentle rustling of her rosary beads. "William," she whispered, thinking of her late husband, "give me strength for what's coming." Her mind drifted to their first Christmas after opening Harrison's department store in 1960. They had barely made enough to keep the lights on, but William had insisted on giving their 5 employees Christmas bonuses. The memory brought both a smile and a slight tremor to her hands, the same tremor that had prompted her recent visit to Dr. Stevens. The diagnosis still felt surreal, 6 months, maybe less. She hadn't told anyone yet, not even David. "Mrs. Harrison?" Father Michael's gentle voice brought her back to the present. "Will you be joining us for midnight mass tonight?" "Of course, Father. 40 years of Harrison family tradition." She smiled, though her heart ached, knowing it would be her last. An hour later, Margaret stood in the grand foyer of Harrison Mansion, supervising the placement of the massive Christmas tree, the same spot where it had stood every Christmas since 1983. The mansion buzzed with activity as staff members hung garlands and positioned poinsettias. "Mrs. H." David Chen called out, carrying a box of cherished ornaments. Even after 30 years as her executive assistant, he still moved with the eager energy of his first day. "The Children's Hospital called. They're expecting us at 3 for the annual toy distribution." Margaret nodded, discreetly sliding a blue envelope into her cardigan pocket. "David, make sure we have extra gifts this year." "I want." The sudden slam of the front door cut her off. James, her eldest, strode in, his expensive Italian shoes clicking against the marble floor. At 50, he looked more like a Wall Street shark than the little boy who once delighted in decorating the store's windows. "Mother, really?" He gestured at the decorators. "The company's Q4 numbers are down, and you're spending a fortune on tinsel?" "Christmas brings customers, James. Your father understood that." Margaret's voice remained steady, though her hands clasped tightly together. "The Harrison Christmas display has been Newport's tradition since I was a kid, yes, I know." James cut her off, his eyes catching the edge of the blue envelope in her pocket. "But times change, Mother. We need to modernize, streamline. The board meeting in January will proceed as it has for 40 years, Margaret finished firmly. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to review the donations for the Children's Hospital." As she turned away, David caught the slight trembling of her shoulders, something he'd been noticing more frequently lately. He watched James storm off toward the library, then followed Margaret to her office. The room remained exactly as William had left it, down to the photos chronicling the store's growth from a single shop front to Newport's premier department store chain. Margaret sank into the leather chair, looking suddenly tired. "David, could you bring me my pills, and please don't mention them to the children?" David nodded, understanding as always. As he left, Margaret pulled out the blue envelope, adding it to a folder marked Christmas Preparations. But these weren't just holiday plans. They were the blueprints for her final Christmas gift to the company she and William had built with love, faith, and hard work. Through the window, she watched a group of employees setting up the outdoor nativity scene, another Harrison tradition. The same scene where, 40 years ago, William had gathered their small staff and told them, "At Harrison's, we're not just a store. We're a family." A family. Margaret touched the cross at her neck, praying she'd have the strength for what needed to be done. because this Christmas, she would finally show everyone the true meaning of those words, even if it was the last thing she ever did. The sound of more car doors slamming announced the arrival of her other children. Margaret straightened her spine, tucked away the folder, and prepared to face what would be her most challenging Christmas yet. Some battles, she had learned, were fought not with strength, but with wisdom, patience, and an unwavering faith in justice, both divine and earthly. Patricia Harrison's Mercedes pulled into the circular driveway just as the church bells struck noon. She stepped out, her designer sunglasses failing to hide her frown at the line of delivery vans dropping off toys for the children's hospital drive. "Mother's at it again," she muttered, watching volunteers unload box after box. "We're running a business, not a charity." Inside, she found Margaret in the living room with David, reviewing donation lists. "Mom, we need to talk about these excessive donations," Patricia announced, without a greeting. "The shareholders are proud of our community involvement," Margaret finished. "Your father always said, 'Dad's been gone for 5 years, Mother. Times have changed.'" Margaret's eyes drifted to the family portrait above the fireplace. Christmas 1995, William beaming proudly, young James helping with the store's books, Patricia organizing the gift drive, and little Robert dressed as an elf for the store's Santa display. The screech of tires interrupted her thoughts. Robert's sports car swerved into the driveway, nearly hitting the last delivery van. At 35, her youngest stumbled out, clearly intoxicated despite the early hour. "Mother," he called out too loudly, weaving his way into the living room. "About my monthly allowance, I need an advance." David stepped forward protectively, but Margaret raised her hand. "Robert, it's not even January. Had some unexpected expenses, you know how it is." He dropped onto the sofa, missing how David quietly removed a crystal vase from his reach. "No, I don't know how it is," Margaret replied. "Neither did your father." "Here we go again." Patricia rolled her eyes. St. William and his work ethic. Margaret watched her children, these strangers wearing familiar faces. Where had she gone wrong? The same halls that once echoed with their laughter now felt cold with their presence. Later, while the siblings retreated to their old rooms to freshen up, David discovered something concerning. Hidden behind last month's charity receipts were bank statements showing massive unauthorized withdrawals from the company's community fund. "Mrs. Harrison," he started, but fell silent when he heard voices from the library. "The old lady's lost it," James was saying. "All this Christmas charity nonsense is draining the company. We need to act before she gives away the entire fortune," Patricia added. "I just need enough to cover my debts." Robert's slurred voice joined in. Margaret, standing in the hallway shadows, heard everything. She clutched her cross, remembering last Christmas when the same voices had sworn to preserve their father's legacy. The afternoon brought more painful contrasts. As longtime employees decorated the grand staircase, a tradition since 1983, they whispered about changes at the stores. Seasonal workers let go without notice, charity programs slashed, the employee Christmas bonus canceled for the first time in 40 years. "Remember when Mr. Harrison would dress up as Santa?" one elderly employee reminisced. "Now we can't even afford candy canes for the children's ward." The annual family prayer before dinner, another Harrison tradition, proved especially difficult. As Father Michael led the blessing, Margaret opened her eyes briefly. James checked his phone. Patricia examined her nails. Only Robert showed any emotion, though it was likely just the alcohol. "Amen," they mumbled half-heartedly. "Your father would be proud of how you're preserving his values," Father Michael said kindly, unaware of the bitter truth. Margaret simply nodded, her hand brushing against the blue envelope in her pocket. Soon, they would all learn what preserving William's values truly meant. For now, she had a Christmas Eve dinner to prepare and 40 years of tradition to uphold, even if she was the only one who still believed in their meaning. Through it all, David watched and waited, loyal as always, sensing the storm gathering beneath the glittering Christmas decorations. In the distance, church bells rang, calling the faithful to evening prayers, their sound a reminder that some traditions were worth fighting for, and some battles could only be won with patience, wisdom, and an unwavering faith in justice. David Chen stood in the children's ward of Newport General Hospital, adjusting his Santa suit. For 20 years, he'd played this role, though his journey to become Santa began long before that. His mind drifted to 1993, when he first arrived at Harrison's department store. Fresh off the bus from New York, with forged papers and broken English, he'd applied for a stockroom position. William Harrison had seen right through his documentation. "Tell me your real story, son," William had said, closing his office door. David had told him everything: escaping poverty in China, working 3 jobs in New York, sending money home to his sick mother. Instead of calling authorities, William had called his lawyer. "Everyone deserves a chance at the American dream," William had said, helping David obtain legal status. "Just promise me you'll pay it forward." A child's cough brought David back to the present. "Santa's here," he announced, entering the ward with his bag of Harrison's toys. Despite the company's recent cutbacks, Margaret had insisted this tradition continue. "Mr. Chen," a nurse whispered, "we heard rumors about the store closing its charity programs." "Not while Mrs. Harrison's in charge," David assured her, though worry gnawed at him. Throughout the day, memories of William surfaced. The morning William taught him retail operations, the Christmas Eve when they'd stayed late wrapping gifts for homeless children. The day William had promoted him to executive assistant, despite board members questioning his qualifications. "Character matters more than credentials," William had insisted. That same year, Megastore Corp had tried to recruit David, offering triple his salary. He'd declined without hesitation. When asked why by Margaret, he'd simply said, "Loyalty isn't for sale." Yeah. Now, watching the children open presents, David recalled his last conversation with William, just days before his death. "Take care of Margaret," William had said. "The kids, they've changed. Money changed them. But you understand what Harrison's really means." A commotion outside interrupted his thoughts. James Harrison stood arguing with hospital administration about excessive donations and liability concerns. "Your father started this tradition," David heard Margaret say, her voice steady but tired. "Father was a businessman, not a charity worker," James snapped. David watched Margaret sway slightly, grabbing a doorframe for support. These episodes were happening more frequently, though she tried to hide them. Later, in the mansion's kitchen, David found Margaret sitting alone, looking exhausted. "You should rest," he suggested gently. "Soon enough," she smiled weakly. "Did I ever tell you about William's first Christmas as Santa?" He was so nervous he put his beard on backwards. They shared a quiet laugh, both feeling William's absence deeply. "The store on 5th Street, Margaret said suddenly. "The one where you started. We're turning it into a community center. Training programs for immigrants, English classes, job placement." David blinked back tears. "Mrs. Harrison, William would have wanted it. And please, after 30 years, call me Margaret." Pastor Michael entered, having arrived for evening prayers. "The children were overjoyed with Santa's visit," he said. "David, your dedication to this community reminds me of William." A crash from upstairs interrupted them. "Robert, drunk again." David moved to investigate, but Margaret stopped him. "Let me tell you something," she said once the pastor left. "William wasn't just giving you a chance that day. He was teaching our children a lesson about true worth. They never learned it, but you did." She pulled out an old photo, David's first day at Harrison's. "You became the son he always wanted, the one who understood that success isn't measured in dollars but in lives touched." David saw tears in her eyes. Before he could respond, James's voice boomed from the study, demanding Margaret's presence for an urgent family discussion. Margaret stood, squeezing David's hand. "Whatever happens next, remember, family isn't always blood. Sometimes it's the people who stay when everyone else walks away." She headed toward the study, leaving David with 30 years of memories and a growing sense that this Christmas would change everything. Through the window, he watched snow beginning to fall, each flake a reminder of William's favorite saying, "In God's time, all things are made right." The library's heavy door clicked shut as James, Patricia, and Robert gathered for their secret meeting. Outside, snow fell on the Harrison mansion's grounds, muffling their heated discussion. "We need to act now," James said, pacing between towering bookshelves. "Megastore's offer expires after the holidays." Patricia sat at their father's old desk, her face tense. I can't keep covering my tracks much longer. The gambling debts. How much? James stopped pacing. 2 million. The casino's threatening to go public. Robert laughed bitterly from the leather sofa. That's nothing. Try owing 5 million to people who don't use lawyers to collect. James slammed his hand on the desk. And I'm being investigated for securities fraud. If Mother looks too closely at the books. She's been looking, Patricia interrupted. I saw her with the charity fund records. Outside the library, David paused while delivering evening coffee. The siblings' voices carried through the old walls. Megastore's offering $3 billion, James continued. Split 3 ways, our problems disappear. What about the employees? Robert asked, surprising his siblings with a moment of clarity. Not our problem, Patricia dismissed. Besides, we need this deal. I've got 48 hours before the casino talks to the press. And my creditors want payment by New Year's, Robert added, his voice shaking. They've already sent photos of my daughter at school. James pulled out documents from his briefcase. I had our lawyers draw these up. If we can prove Mother's mentally incompetent. The Christmas donations, Patricia brightened. We can use those. No sane CEO gives away that much money. Plus her conversations with Dad's portrait, Robert added. I've recorded some on my phone. David's hand tightened around the coffee tray. In the adjacent room, Margaret sat in darkness, her phone recording every word through an app David had installed last week. The employee stock program, James continued, will claim it shows deteriorating judgment. No sound business owner gives workers that much control. What about David? Robert asked. He knows everything about the company. Already handled, James smiled coldly. I've got proof he entered the country illegally. 1 call to immigration. Father would never, Robert started. Father's dead, Patricia snapped. And unless we want to end up bankrupt or worse, we do this now. Margaret closed her eyes, her suspicions confirmed. Beside her chair sat the blue envelope containing 30 years of evidence. Every fraud, every theft, every betrayal, carefully documented. The court hearing set for December 26th, James explained. Judge Parker owes me a favor. Mother will be declared incompetent and will have control in time for the megastore deal. What about Christmas dinner? Robert asked. We play along, Patricia answered. One last family Christmas. Then Monday morning, Mother gets moved to a care facility for her own good. In the hallway, David silently backed away, his heart heavy. He found Margaret in William's study, staring at the falling snow. You heard? She asked without turning. Yes. Mrs. Harrison, we should call the police. Not yet. She touched the cross at her neck. Tomorrow night, justice will have its moment. 30 years of greed and betrayal will end where it began at the Christmas dinner table. The risks are nothing compared to the risk of letting them destroy everything William built. She turned, her face resolute. Make sure everyone comes tomorrow. Every employee, every board member, every friend. Tell them it's my Christmas wish. David nodded, understanding. As he left, he heard her whisper to William's portrait. Our children forgot your lessons, my love. But tomorrow, they'll remember. God's justice may be patient, but it's always perfect. In the library, the siblings finished their plotting, unaware that their moment of triumph would become their greatest downfall. Outside, the snow continued falling, covering Newport in a blanket of white, nature's own mask, over the darkness brewing inside the Harrison mansion. St. Patrick's Church filled quickly for Christmas Eve Mass. The Harrison family occupied their usual front pew, a tradition now more spectacle than devotion. Margaret sat quietly, her children flanking her like guards, rather than family. Father Michael's homily focused on family and forgiveness. Christmas reminds us that true wealth isn't found in bank accounts, but in the love we share. Patricia checked her phone. James reviewed documents. Robert dozed off. After Mass, Margaret overheard James speaking with Judge Parker. Everything's set for tomorrow's hearing, just a routine competency review. Back at the mansion, the annual Christmas Eve hot chocolate gathering commenced in the library. Steam rose from William's old silver service as David poured. Mother, James began, setting down his cup. We need to discuss the company's future. Margaret stirred her chocolate slowly. On Christmas Eve, James, Megastore Corp has made an offer. $3 billion. He slid papers across the table. The board supports the sale. The board? Margaret's hand trembled slightly. Or the board members you've threatened. Patricia leaned forward. Mother, be reasonable. The market's changing. These charitable traditions, the employee programs, they're destroying shareholder value. We're worried about you, Robert added, his rehearsed concern obvious. The excessive donations, the conversations with Dad's portrait. All this stress isn't good for you, Patricia pressed. The doctors agree. Doctors I've never met? Margaret interrupted. You're not well, Mother, James stated firmly. If you don't sign the sale agreement, we'll be forced to take legal action, for your own protection. Margaret's cup clattered against its saucer. My own protection? A temporary guardianship, James explained, just until the sale concludes. David moved to intervene, but Margaret's slight gesture stopped him. You declare your own mother incompetent? On Christmas? Don't make this harder than necessary, Patricia warned. Sign the papers, or tomorrow morning we'll have no choice. Margaret's voice quavered. And the employees, their pensions, the charitable foundation? Megastore will honor all legal obligations, James assured smoothly. Legal obligations, Margaret repeated. Not moral ones. Mother, Robert started. I'm tired, Margaret announced, standing shakily. We'll discuss this tomorrow. The papers need your signature tonight, James insisted. Tomorrow, Margaret's voice hardened, at Christmas dinner, in front of everyone. After they left, David approached Margaret. Should I call the lawyers? No need. She touched the blue envelope in her pocket. Everything's ready. Make sure all the guests arrive by 6 tomorrow, especially the board members. Mrs. Harrison, your health will last long enough. She moved to the window, watching snow fall. Strange, isn't it? They think I'm talking to William's portrait, but really, I've been recording their confessions. In the hallway, Tom Wilson, the head accountant, approached David. Mr. Chen, about tomorrow, have been offered a position at Megastore. 30 years with Harrisons, and you'd betray that? Tom looked away. They're threatening to audit my department. They know about the discrepancies. The ones James ordered you to create? Tom nodded miserably. Come tomorrow, David said. Trust in Mrs. Harrison. Later, Margaret knelt by her bed, her nightly prayers different this Christmas Eve. Lord, give me strength for tomorrow. Not for revenge, but for justice. Not for punishment, but for redemption. In their rooms, her children plotted final details. In his apartment above the garage, David prepared evidence. And in her room, Margaret held William's photo, whispering, Tomorrow, my love. Tomorrow they'll learn that some sins carry their own punishment, and some treasures are worth more than gold. The mansion settled into silence, snow continuing to fall, covering Newport in white as Christmas Eve became Christmas Day, the day when the Harrison family's facade would finally shatter, revealing the truth beneath 40 years of tradition and lies. Christmas morning dawned clear and cold over Newport. Margaret sat in William's study, surrounded by 40 years of memories. Family photos lined the walls, snapshots of a legacy her children seemed determined to destroy. She opened his desk drawer, touching the brass keyring he'd always carried. One photo caught her eye. Opening day, 1960. William standing proudly in front of their first store, Margaret by his side, both young and full of dreams. Remember what you said that day? She asked the photo. Our store will be different. We'll treat everyone like family. She pulled out William's old ledger. Inside, neat columns tracked not just profits but employee milestones. Weddings, births, graduations. Every Christmas bonus personally calculated by William to match each family's needs. The door creaked. Mrs. Harrison? David entered with morning tea. The children are searching the house for documents. Let them search, she smiled, touching a hidden panel in the desk. William knew our children better than I thought. He planned for this. David sat in his usual chair. I remember my first Christmas here. Mr. Harrison found out my mother was sick in China. He paid for her treatment, Margaret nodded. Never told anyone. Changed my life. David hesitated. Yesterday, James threatened to report my old immigration status. William fixed that legally 20 years ago. Margaret pulled out more photos. They think they know everything about this company, but they know nothing. Footsteps in the hallway made them pause. Patricia's voice drifted in. The safe in Father's study. Mother's been going through papers. Margaret opened the safe slowly, letting them hear. Inside lay obvious documents, property deeds, stock certificates, old photos. James burst in. "Mother, we need those papers. Help yourself." She stepped aside. "Your father believed in transparency." They fell upon the safe like hungry wolves. Margaret watched them ignore the one thing that mattered, a small brass button behind the safe's top shelf. "Just bank statements," Patricia complained. "Keep looking," James ordered. "The real documents must be here somewhere." "Daddy's old movies." Robert pulled out film reels. "Remember watching these on Christmas?" "Put those back," James snapped. "We need to find." "The papers that prove I'm incompetent," Margaret's voice cut through their searching, "were the ones showing your fraud?" Her children froze. "Mother, you're confused," Patricia started. "Am I?" Margaret touched William's portrait. "Your father taught you everything about business, but nothing about integrity." "Father was a businessman," James argued. "He'd understand modernizing." "Modernizing?" Margaret laughed softly. "Is that what you call embezzlement now?" Robert dropped the files he was holding. "Mother, please." "Please what? Please ignore the millions you've stolen, the lives you're willing to destroy?" "We're protecting you," Patricia insisted. "No." Margaret stood straighter. "You're protecting yourselves, but your father protected the company." She pressed the brass button behind the shelf. A hidden panel slid open, revealing a steel box. "What's that?" James demanded. "Your father's real legacy, the one you'll discover tonight, along with everyone else." "Mother." "Now get out of his study. You lost the right to be here when you betrayed everything he built." After they left, David watched Margaret sink into William's chair. "The children found something in the library," he reported. "They think it helps their case." "Good." Margaret nodded. "Everything's proceeding exactly as William planned." "He knew this would happen? He knew our children, knew money would poison them." She touched the hidden box. "Tonight will fulfill his final wish, protecting Harrison's true family." Outside, carolers began singing Silent Night. Margaret closed her eyes, remembering William's last Christmas, his final words about their legacy. "A business can be rebuilt," he'd said, "but trust, loyalty, faith, once broken, they're gone forever. Promise me, Margaret, promise you'll protect the real treasure." "I promise," she'd whispered. Now, 5 years later, she would keep that promise. The stage was set, the players in position. Tonight, William's true legacy would be revealed, and justice, both human and divine, would finally be served. "It's time," she told David. "Let's prepare for dinner." The grandfather clock struck noon, its chimes echoing through the mansion like a countdown to revelation. In a few hours, 40 years of tradition would end, and a new chapter would begin, one written not in dollars, but in truth. 6 o'clock brought the first guests to Harrison Mansion. Board members, longtime employees, and community leaders arrived despite the snow, drawn by Margaret's personal invitation for this special Christmas dinner. James intercepted the first group of employees at the door. "Unfortunately, the family dinner has been canceled. Mother isn't feeling well." "I'm feeling perfectly fine," Margaret's voice rang out from the staircase. "Please, everyone come in. This is a Harrison tradition, after all." Tom Wilson, the head accountant, entered nervously, avoiding James's glare. Behind him came store managers, supervisors, and even retired employees, all part of the Harrison extended family. "Mother, this is inappropriate," Patricia hissed. These people built this company," Margaret cut her off. "They deserve to be here." Father Michael arrived with the mayor and several prominent community leaders. "Margaret, the Children's Hospital Board asked me to thank you for the new wing." "New wing?" James interrupted. "What new wing?" "The pediatric center," David explained calmly. "Mrs. Harrison signed the papers last week." "She can't do that," Patricia exploded. "That money is mine to allocate," Margaret finished. "Now shall we move to the dining room?" The grand dining room sparkled with Christmas decorations. Margaret had arranged the seating carefully, board members mixed with employees, executives beside store clerks. Her children she placed directly across from her, where she could watch their faces. "Before we begin," James stood, "I have an announcement." "After dinner," Margaret interrupted. "Christmas traditions first." Sarah Johnson, their oldest employee, led the blessing as she had for 30 years. James checked his phone. Patricia whispered frantically to her lawyer. Robert stared at his empty wine glass, hands shaking. "Mother," Patricia tried again, "about the megastore offer." Did you know, Margaret addressed the table, that Patricia lost $2 million gambling this year? Money taken from the employee pension fund. The room fell silent. Mother, Patricia gasped, you're confused. Or that James has been selling company secrets to competitors? That Robert's been borrowing from loan sharks? That's enough, James stood. Mother clearly isn't well. This display proves. Proves what? Margaret's voice remained calm. That I know what you've done? That your father knew what you'd become? Security, James called out. Please escort these people out. This is a private family matter. The security guards didn't move. They don't work for you, David explained. They work for the Harrison Trust. The what? Patricia demanded. All will be explained, Margaret assured them. But first, dinner. It's Christmas, after all. The meal proceeded in tense silence. Employees exchanged worried glances. Board members whispered among themselves. Margaret's children barely touched their food, watching their mother with growing unease. Now, Margaret said as dessert was served, about that announcement, James? This is ridiculous, he sputtered. You can't protect my husband's legacy? Can't stop you from destroying lives? She nodded to David, who dimmed the lights. Actually, I can, and your father already did. A screen lowered at the end of the dining room, the same screen where they'd watched Christmas movies as children. But tonight, it would show a very different kind of family film. What's going on? Robert asked, his voice shaking. Justice, Margaret answered. God's justice, your father's justice and mine. After all, Christmas is a time for gifts, and truth is the greatest gift of all. The screen flickered to life, showing William's face. The same William who had built an empire on trust, who had treated employees like family, who had seen this day coming long before anyone else. Around the table, 40 years of lies were about to unravel. Margaret touched the cross at her neck, said a silent prayer, and prepared to watch justice unfold, not with anger, but with the quiet certainty of long-planned redemption. The room held its breath as William began to speak, his recorded voice carrying the weight of final judgment. Christmas dinner was about to become Christmas justice, served cold but righteous, exactly as planned. William Harrison's face filled the screen, recorded in his study 5 years ago, shortly before his death. Everyone at the table recognized his characteristic warmth, now tinged with sadness. If you're watching this, William began, then everything I feared has come to pass. To those gathered here on Christmas, I owe you the truth about my children and your future. James lunged for the projector. This is ridiculous. Security, David called quietly. 2 guards stepped forward, halting James's movement. William's voice continued. First, to our employees, my true family. I've watched my children's actions with growing concern. They've forgotten what Harrison's means, so I'm setting things right. Patricia's lawyer stood. This has no legal. Actually, Margaret interrupted, it was properly notarized and filed. Please continue watching. The video shifted to security footage. James in his office, shredding documents. Patricia withdrawing millions from employee accounts. Robert making deals with suspicious men in parking lots. Over the past decade, William's voice explained, I've gathered evidence of every fraud, every theft, every betrayal. The dates, amounts, and documentation are in the sealed files being distributed now. David and several security guards handed out blue folders to board members and lawyers. My God, the company's chief counsel whispered, reviewing the contents. That's not all, William continued. James sold customer data to identity thieves. Patricia embezzled from our children's charity. Robert used company funds to pay gambling debts. The children's faces drained of color. But proving their crimes wasn't enough. I needed to protect the company's future. So 5 years ago, I created the Harrison Employee Trust. Gasps filled the room. 60% of company shares now belong to our employees, through a program Margaret and David have quietly implemented. The remaining 40% is divided between our charitable foundation and our pension fund. You can't do this, James shouted. He already did, Margaret said softly. The video showed more evidence. Offshore accounts, falsified records, secret meetings with competitors. Employees watched in shock as decades of corruption unfolded. To my children, William's voice grew heavy. I gave you everything, not just wealth, but values, principles, purpose. You chose greed instead, so I choose to give my legacy to those who deserve it. Sarah Johnson, Their oldest employee began to cry. Tom Wilson stared at his hands, guilt evident on his face. "The trust takes full effect the moment this video plays," William explained. "And yes, James, I made it legally bulletproof. Your lawyers can confirm." Several attorneys nodded grimly. Margaret will oversee the transition. David Chen, who proved himself the son I wished I'd had, will become CEO. The board will be restructured to include employee representatives. Robert vomited into his napkin. Patricia's lawyer quietly gathered his papers and left. "One final thing," William added. "A copy of this evidence has already been sent to the FBI, SEC, and Newport Police. Merry Christmas." The screen went dark. Silence filled the room until James found his voice. "Mother, you helped him do this? Your own children?" "I helped him save his life's work," Margaret answered. "From you." "You'll die alone," Patricia spat, standing. "No," David stepped forward. "She has her real family right here." Police sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. "Timing was always your father's specialty," Margaret noted. "Now, I suggest you three wait quietly for the authorities. Creating a scene will only make things worse." Father Michael moved to Robert, who had begun to sob. The mayor excused himself, avoiding eye contact. Board members huddled with lawyers, reviewing documents. Outside, red and blue lights reflected off the snow as police cars pulled up to Harrison Mansion. Inside, 40 years of Christmas tradition had transformed into something else. A moment of justice long planned and perfectly executed. Margaret watched it all, feeling not triumph, but sadness. Sometimes she realized the greatest gift a parent could give was the gift of consequences. Even on Christmas. Especially on Christmas. The first officers entered the dining room as the grandfather clock struck 9, its chimes marking the end of one Harrison era and the beginning of another. While police interviewed James, Patricia, and Robert in separate rooms, Margaret addressed the remaining dinner guests in the main hall. "There's more to share," she announced. "David, please explain the employee stock ownership program." David stepped forward, still processing his new role. "The Harrison Employee Trust isn't just about ownership. It's about preserving William's vision." He outlined the program's details. Every employee with 5 years of service would receive shares. Retirement benefits would double. The charitable foundation would expand. "This is unprecedented," the mayor spoke up. "The largest employee-owned department store in the country." Father Michael stepped forward. "I've known David Chen for 30 years, watched him serve this community. William chose wisely." "But the transition," a board member started, "is already complete," Margaret interrupted. "The paperwork was filed months ago. David has been effectively running the company while James was busy planning its sale." Tom Wilson raised his hand nervously. "Those discrepancies I was forced to create are documented and explained in the files," David assured him. "You'll face no charges for following James's orders under duress." Sarah Johnson stood shakily. "Mrs. Harrison, what about the Christmas charity programs? Will be expanded?" Margaret smiled. "Starting with the new children's wing." A detective entered the hall. "Mrs. Harrison, we've verified the evidence. Federal agents are en route for the formal arrests." Patricia's screams echoed from another room. James could be heard demanding his lawyer. Robert had apparently passed out. "I have one more announcement," Margaret said. "Dr. Stevens confirmed it last month. I have terminal cancer, 6 months at most." Gasps filled the room. David stepped closer protectively. "That's why timing was crucial. The company needed protection before." She paused. "Well, before God calls me home." "Mrs. Harrison," the chief of police approached. "Given the circumstances, we can handle the arrests discreetly." "No," Margaret said firmly. "The truth shouldn't hide in shadows." Reporters had gathered outside, alerted by police activity at the mansion. Camera flashes lit up the snowy night. "David," Margaret turned to him. "You're ready for this. William knew it. I know it. I won't let you down," he promised. "You never have." She addressed the room. "Tomorrow's papers will talk about scandal and arrests, but that's not the real story. The real story is about faith, in God, in justice, in good people doing right things." Father Michael nodded. "The Lord works in mysterious ways." "Not so mysterious," Margaret smiled. "Sometimes he works through a husband's foresight, a wife's patience, and a faithful employee's loyalty." The federal agents arrived, leading James, Patricia, and Robert out in handcuffs. The children avoided everyone's eyes as they passed. "Mother, please," Robert whimpered. Margaret turned away. Sometimes love meant letting people face consequences. David gathered the employees. "Tomorrow, all stores will open as usual. Our customers need to see that Harrison stands strong." The mayor stepped forward. "The city stands with Harrisons. This company has been our backbone for 40 years. One by one, guests departed into the snowy night. Sarah Johnson hugged Margaret tightly. Board members shook David's hand. Father Michael blessed them both. Finally, only Margaret and David remained in the grand hall. "William would be proud," she said softly. "Of you," David replied. "You carried this burden alone. Not alone." She touched her cross. "Never alone." Outside, the last police cars pulled away. Reporters followed, rushing to make their deadlines. The mansion's Christmas lights still twinkled, reflecting off fresh snow, illuminating the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Christmas had brought its gift of truth. Justice had been served. And Harrison's legacy would continue, not through blood, but through the family of the heart, exactly as William had planned. The day after Christmas dawned with newspaper headlines blazing: Harrison family arrested, retail empire's Christmas revelation, employee trust takes control of Harrison's. In the mansion's study, Margaret watched David sign the final transition documents. Lawyers and board members witnessed each signature, ensuring everything was legally binding. "The stock transfers are complete," the corporate attorney confirmed. "The Harrison Employee Trust now officially controls the company." David's hand shook slightly as he signed the last page. "It still feels unreal." "It's very real," Margaret assured him, "just like the federal charges against my children." The phone hadn't stopped ringing since dawn. Media wanted statements. Business partners needed reassurance. Employees sought confirmation their jobs were safe. "The stores opened on time," Sarah Johnson reported. "Customers are showing support. Some brought cards and flowers." David reviewed status reports from all locations. Despite the chaos, every Harrison store maintained normal operations. Employees stood proud, many wearing their years of service pins. "Mrs. Harrison?" A police detective entered. "We need to discuss the charges." Margaret nodded. The evidence was overwhelming. James faced 20 years for fraud. Patricia would serve at least 10 for embezzlement. Robert's loan shark connections added criminal conspiracy charges. "They're requesting a private meeting," the detective added. "No," Margaret said firmly. "Everything in open court." Tom Wilson arrived with financial updates. "The company's actually stronger than we knew. Once we corrected James's false records." "William always said truth breeds strength," Margaret smiled. The mayor visited briefly, pledging city support. Chamber of Commerce members sent a joint letter backing the new employee-owned structure. Even competitors expressed admiration for the bold transition. Around noon, Robert's wife came to collect their children's things. "He wanted me to say—" "There's nothing to say," Margaret interrupted gently. "Actions have consequences." David organized an emergency board meeting. Employee representatives took their seats alongside existing members. The mood was purposeful, focused on future plans rather than past scandals. "The spring charity gala?" Sarah asked. "Will proceed as always," David confirmed. "Every tradition William valued continues." Margaret watched proudly as David led the meeting. He outlined expansion plans, employee benefit increases, and community program enhancements. William's vision lived on through him. "The pension fund is secure," the financial advisor reported, "and the new profit-sharing structure will begin immediately," David finished. "Every employee shares in our success." Late afternoon brought unexpected news. Robert had attempted suicide in his cell. He survived, but the attempt prompted his first honest words in years. "I'm sorry," he'd written. "Dad was right about everything." Margaret received the note calmly. "Ensure he gets proper care," she told the detective. "He's still my son." As evening approached, David found Margaret in William's study. "The transition team needs final approval on—" He stopped, seeing her expression. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," she smiled. "Everything's exact as William planned. The company's safe, justice is served, his legacy continues. Through you," David said softly. "Through us all." She handed him William's old key ring. "The store keys, they're yours now." David held them reverently. "I'll honor his trust. You already have." Margaret touched the cross at her neck. "God sends us the children we need, not always the ones we birth." Outside the study, Harrison's employees continued their work, strengthened by ownership, united in purpose. The true inheritance wasn't money or power, but the chance to continue William's mission of treating business as family and profit as responsibility. The Christmas tree still stood in the foyer, its lights reflecting off the fresh snow outside. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, in this moment, justice and destiny aligned perfectly. William's true legacy lived on, not through those who shared his name, but through those who shared his values. The day after the arrests, Harrison's employees gathered in the mansion's grand hall. Christmas decorations still sparkled, but the mood had shifted from shock to determination. Our first priority, David addressed the group, is protecting what William and Margaret built. Sarah Johnson stood up. Remember the Christmas of '85? The blizzard? William kept the store open as a shelter. Others shared memories. William helping employees with medical bills, Margaret organizing college scholarships, countless small kindnesses that built loyalty over decades. That's who we really are, David affirmed, and who we'll continue to be. The door opened quietly. Everyone turned as Robert entered, escorted by 2 officers. He looked pale, bandages visible under his sleeves. "Mother," he said softly. "I needed to." Margaret approached her youngest. "You tried to take the coward's way out." "I couldn't face," he swallowed hard. "Everything you and Dad built, everything we destroyed." "Not we," Margaret corrected. "You had choices, each of you." "The loan sharks?" Robert continued. "They were going to hurt my daughter. I panicked." "You could have asked for help." "Pride," Robert whispered. "Same thing that destroyed James and Patricia." David watched carefully as mother and son faced each other. Decades of pain hung between them. "I can't fix what I broke," Robert admitted. "But I want to try. Not for the money, there isn't any now, but because Dad was right about everything." Margaret studied him. "Actions, not words, Robert." "I'm pleading guilty," he said. "Full confession, no deals." The officers confirmed with a nod. "It's a start," laughed Margaret aloud. David stepped forward. "The company will ensure your daughter's safety." "Why?" Robert asked. "After what I did?" "Because that's what family does," David replied. "Real family." As Robert was led away, David announced the next phase of transition. The employee stock program would expand, community outreach would double. The Children's Hospital wing would break ground in spring. "We're also launching the William Harrison Memorial Scholarship," David continued, "for employees, children, and community students." Sarah wiped tears. "Just like he would have wanted." Margaret stood. "William believed business had a soul, not just profits but purpose. You all prove him right every day." She detailed plans for new training programs, daycare facilities, and retirement benefits. Every initiative focused on employees and community. "The papers are calling it revolutionary," someone mentioned. "It's not revolutionary," Margaret corrected. "It's just right." As the meeting ended, employees lingered to share more memories. Stories of William's kindness, Margaret's strength, the true spirit of Harrison's. "Dad gave out turkeys every Christmas," Robert said suddenly from the doorway. "Delivered them himself." "Still do," Sarah confirmed. "Never missed a year." Robert nodded, then let the officers lead him out. His steps were heavy, but his spine was straight, finally choosing dignity over pride. Margaret watched him go. Redemption starts with truth. The rest of the day brought more transitions. David moved into the CEO's office, placing William's photo on the desk. Margaret reviewed charity proposals. Employees adjusted to their new roles as owners. "The other stores report record sales," Sarah announced. "Customers are choosing us deliberately, supporting employee ownership." Evening found Margaret and David in the garden, despite the cold. Christmas lights twinkled above them. "William always said business was about more than money," Margaret mused. "It was about building something lasting, something good." "We'll keep building," David promised. Inside, phones still rang with media requests. Lawyers still processed paperwork. But underneath all that, something more important was happening. A company was remembering its soul. A legacy was finding its future. And in that moment, on that snowy evening, the true spirit of Christmas, of giving, of justice, of redemption, felt very real indeed. 1 year later, Christmas Eve 2024, snow fell softly on Newport as cars filled the Harrison Mansion driveway. Inside, David Chen supervised the same Christmas decorations that had graced the home for 40 years. Everything just as Mrs. Harrison wanted. Sarah Johnson nodded approvingly. The past year had transformed Harrison's department stores. Employee ownership brought record profits. The new children's hospital wing served hundreds. Community programs expanded beyond William's wildest dreams. David adjusted his tie, preparing to address the gathered employees. The annual Christmas dinner continued, though the guest list had changed. No corporate raiders or hostile board members, just family. The real Harrison family. Hard to believe it's been a year, Tom Wilson said, arranging place cards. Much had changed. James and Patricia remained in federal prison. Robert, serving a reduced sentence for cooperation, worked with prison ministries. His daughter attended college on a Harrison scholarship. The new store opens in spring, David announced to the assembled crowd. Our first expansion in 10 years. Applause filled the room. Harrison's had not just survived, it had thrived. And the William and Margaret Harrison Community Center? Father Michael asked. Construction starts January 1st, David confirmed. The old 5th Street store will help immigrants, just like it helped me. Sarah stepped forward. We have something to share. She unveiled a portrait, Margaret in the garden she loved, beside William's favorite roses. It would hang beside his in the boardroom. She insisted no formal memorials, David smiled, but she never said no paintings. The gathering moved to the dining room, where Margaret's chair remained empty at the head of the table. She had passed peacefully in June, 6 months after her diagnosis, having lived to see her husband's legacy secured. Her last words, Father Michael shared, were about family. Not the one she bore, but the one she built with all of you. David raised his glass. To Margaret Harrison, who taught us that real wealth isn't in bank accounts. To William Harrison, Sarah added, who knew that business had a soul. And to family, Tom concluded, the kind you choose and earn. The evening continued with stories. Employees shared memories of both Harrisons, their kindness, their vision, their faith in people over profits. Later, David visited the children's hospital, wearing the Santa suit Margaret had insisted he keep. In the new Harrison wing, he distributed gifts just as William had done decades ago. Mr. Chen? A nurse stopped him. We found this in Mrs. Harrison's papers. She wanted you to have it today. The envelope contained a simple note. David, William saw the son we needed. I saw the future we wanted. You've proven us both right. Love, Margaret. Back at the mansion, David walked the quiet halls. The company's future was secure. Employee ownership had revolutionized retail. The Harrison name meant more than ever. In William's study, David sat in the old leather chair. On the desk, 3 photos stood together. William on opening day 1960, Margaret at last year's Christmas dinner, and the entire Harrison's employee family at the trust signing. Outside, carolers sang Silent Night in the snow. Inside, the mansion's Christmas lights glowed warmly. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new chances to prove that business could have both profit and purpose. Merry Christmas, David whispered to the photos. The legacy lived on, not in blood, but in bonds stronger than genetics, in faith kept, in trust earned, in family forged by choice rather than chance. And somewhere he knew, William and Margaret Harrison were smiling, their life's work safe in the hands of those who truly understood that success wasn't measured in dollars, but in lives touched and values preserved. The grandfather clock struck midnight, marking another Christmas at Harrison's. Different, yet the same. Changed, yet eternal. Just as it should be. Did this story touch your heart? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let us know if you've ever witnessed justice being served in such a powerful way. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming tales that remind us that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in the lives we touch and the legacy we leave behind. Remember, sometimes God's greatest gifts come wrapped in life's hardest lessons.